and I'll turn it over to Lindsay and Casey. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks for having us. Lindsay, I don't know if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself first, and then I'll kind of dive in.
Yeah, for sure. We've been doing this for almost 2 years now, and I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself, which is like the bane of Zoom. Everyone gets so mad at each other when they're muted. My name is Lindsay. I'm happy to be talking with you all today. I am a post-conviction victim advocate with the Blue Bench. I have worked for the Blue Bench for just a little under 3 years now, and have been in victim services with all different types of crimes and sexual assault for many years. So I'm happy to be here with you all today.
And my name is Casey Ballinger. I use she, her pronouns. I have also been employed with the Blue Bench for a little under 3 years. Lindsay and I started at the same time. This is a pilot program in the state of Colorado. So we're the first to be doing it and are very excited for the opportunity to speak to everyone about what post-conviction services can look like for survivors of sexual assault following conviction in the criminal legal system, and have been working in the victim service field for about 7 years now, and started working primarily with survivors of intimate partner violence, and then again stepped into this role about 3 years ago. Quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to kind of review the role as it's been structured by the Blue Bench, the kind of frequently asked questions and services that we provide to victim survivors, what probation supervision looks like for those who have been convicted of sex offenses in the state of Colorado looks like, a little bit about offense specific treatment. I did see that we have an offense specific provider here as well, and that's awesome. Feel free to jump in if there's anything you'd like to add as well. We're going to talk about the clarification process today. It's a very large piece of the post-conviction world that is probably the biggest opportunity for victim survivors to get involved with, and would like to spread the word on that process as well. Policy and how our role gets involved in that in the state of Colorado, and then a little bit of the overview of what victim representation looks like on supervision teams. And we'll dive into what all of those pieces are about farther into the presentation. And I do want to say, if you have any questions, like Maria said, please jump in, stick them in the chat. We will try to answer them as quickly as possible. And if we know that they're going to come up later on, we'll address them at that point, but definitely want this to be interactive and helpful. We don't want to waste your time with things that we think are important. And so if you have anything you're curious to learn more about, please let us know. Regarding language, Lindsay and I, our role exists in several spaces. So we are providing direct service to victim survivors, and are always respectful of whatever the folks that we're working with want to be called. And we know that that sort of runs the gambit and is a spectrum. And for the sake of this presentation, we'll be using the terms victim and survivor, maybe interchangeably, maybe together, because we work within the criminal legal system. The term victim does come up a lot. And so we use all of those things interchangeably. And then for folks who have caused harm, historically have been referred to as sex offenders. A lot of that conversation is changing in the spaces that we do our work. And we'll get into that a little bit later as well. But we'll likely be using these terms: person who caused harm, a juvenile or adult who has committed a sexual offense. And then a little bit about the organization that we're employed by. So we work for the Blue Bench, which is a 501c3 that serves the Denver metro area. We basically, anything that we can do to help support and empower survivors of sexual harm, we try to make sure that happens. So we've got a prevention program that goes into schools and provides education around consent, and a multitude of other things to students of all age ranges. We have a 24-hour emergency hotline that is available in both Spanish and English to folks who may need support around anything. They could be secondary survivors, friends, family of folks who aren't sure how to support someone in their life who's been sexually assaulted. survivors who may need assistance, folks who want us to meet them at the hospital and help be a support system for them during SANE exams, all of those things. Our hotline is available to help with. We provide individual and group therapy. We have a team of really great trauma therapists on staff. We have case managers who will help support folks regardless of where they're at in their trauma healing journey, whether it's meeting them at the hospital, to attending court hearings, to helping get them connected with resources in the community. They'll help with that. And then Lindsay and my role that gets involved after sentencing occurs. So that post-conviction victim advocacy.
So we're going to talk about our role. We understand that this is a little tricky because there are two post-conviction victim advocates, Casey and I, right now that we know of. There are some other folks that are in other areas of victim services that are starting to do this work. And our goal for this webinar and just for lots of things we're talking about in the future is to, one, let you all know that this type of advocacy exists and it's important and what it's serving. And then also let people know that they can do some of this advocacy in their own positions. So you don't have to be a PCVA with the Blue Bench or some other organization to know about some of these things that go on and to be able to advocate for the survivor that you are working with. So that's kind of what we're doing. The post-conviction victim advocate role was created, again, as advocacy services for someone who's the person who has caused harm has been found guilty by the courts, either by trial or by plea, and is sentenced to probation, juveniles and adults. Casey and I do work some cases with parole, with people that have caused harm getting out of the Department of Corrections. But most of our caseload is with folks sentenced to probation because most of people who have committed a sex offense are sentenced to probation. So this role is different from systems-based advocates because we are confidential advocates. We are completely independent from the system, although we work so interchangeably within the system. So we work with often specific treatment providers and probation officers and parole officers and DA's offices and lawyers and everybody that's involved in the system, but we're just, we're working with them on the outside. So I think that that's important for a lot of victim survivors because we have the ability to interact with the system, but we're not employed by probation. We're not employed by, the DA or the state. So we're able to really just work for their survivor. We're here for them. Our role gives us different accesses to different information. So when we're navigating this post-conviction victim advocate process, we have releases with probation. We'll talk a little more about this, I think, further down the slides, but we have releases with probation. We'll have a release with an offense-specific treatment provider and various accesses to different information. So we're really providing the victim survivor with things that are going to be helpful for them, things that are important for them to know. And we're checking to make sure that those things are okay to share with the survivor with all the other community partners we work with. So the treatment providers, the probation officers, everybody. So it's a tricky balance. And most of the time we're just keeping that flow of communication open so that everybody knows what's going on. So it's important to be informed about post-conviction advocacy because a lot of the times we see that survivors are maybe being advocated for by a systems-based advocate or another community-based advocate, and that person is unaware of some of the things they could be helping the survivor with, or some of the things that the survivor doesn't even know about that they should know about. So it's really important for us to kind of spread the word about this particular form of advocacy. But a lot of you are victim support in this webinar right now. So the gamut, but emotional crisis support. We do a lot of case management. So helping folks with resources, helping folks with protection orders, answering questions from all different aspects of the system, that kind of thing. We certainly can and do attend court with our victim survivors. Oftentimes that's for sentencing hearings. We'll meet the victim survivors at the sentencing hearing with the district attorney, victim advocates. We'll go to probation revocation hearings. We'll go to juvenile review hearings. And sometimes that's with the victim survivor, and sometimes it's in place of the victim survivor. So I have a lot of survivors I work with right now that want to know what's happening in court, want to understand everything that took place, but don't want to be there. So that is a big part of our role as well. We provide victim representation on the supervision teams, and we're going to get into this more later, but the person who has committed a sex offense has a supervision team, and we are on those teams also as a victim representative and able to do some really wonderful things within those teams. We engage with the Sex Offender Management Board. So we are on a couple different, Casey and I are on a couple different committees. We make sure we stay on top of the ever-changing legislation and the standards and guidelines that are happening throughout the SOMB. And we encourage, and we'll talk more about this too, but we encourage lots of victims, advocates and victim support personnel throughout the state to be involved with the SOMB because it's a big deal. A lot of things get decided in that space. And then of course, Casey and I also do some education to people who have committed sex offenses. So we do victim impact classes. Sometimes we'll join in, their treatment provider will ask us to join in on a particular session or a particular meeting and talk about a specific thing related to victim empathy, accountability, what victims go through, what their specific victim has gone through, all of that kind of stuff. So we're providing some education on the other side as well, which is really great because I think we all have the same goal and we all want the same thing, which is for everyone to be the happiest, healthiest version of themselves after this bad thing has happened. And then just a quick note about case referrals. We generally get cases from the district attorney's office or from our probation officers that we work with. But we could get them from all different aspects. I've had offense specific treatment providers contact me and ask me to get involved in a case. Victims hear about it and contact us. But a lot of the times with the district attorney's office, we're coming in, like I said, at that sentencing hearing, and we're able to meet the victim survivor and introduce ourselves and kind of explain who this other person is that's going to be contacting them. And so these are just some FAQs that there's a bunch. we can put them all, we didn't put them all on here, but these are the big ones. So these, and I'm sure that if you're working with victims and survivors in some capacity with sexual assault, you've heard many of these. Tons of questions about what the person who committed an offense is allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. Lots of questions about the victim survivor safety and the protection order. Lots of things about disclosure. I mean, I think there's a lot of myths and kind of like weird, incorrect things that people think about the sex offender world. And so a lot of times we're doing a lot of education for victim survivors. We're dispelling some of those things and telling them how things have changed and telling them how it is nowadays, especially in Colorado.
So I think one of the biggest services that we can provide that fills a gap that has historically been around for the victim service world is that there has always been sort of this very thick line that runs between what's happening for the survivor and what's happening for the person who caused them harm. And I think one of the cool things and that I'm very excited about Lindsay and my job and getting the word out there about all of the other things that we could be providing to these survivors is the idea that we can have a say in how treatment and supervision is going, and that the victim survivor can provide that feedback as the person in some of these cases, or a lot of these cases, knows this person pretty well can make sure that that accountability is happening in a safe way. So Lindsay and I are showing up as a liaison in some of these spaces where it may not be appropriate for the victim survivor to be present. So a probation office, a treatment provider's office, and are able to relay the concerns of the victim survivor with their permission to the supervision teams that supervise these folks, and sometimes to them directly, to make sure, again, that we're not missing anything, that voice is still being considered in these spaces. Whereas I think historically, or at least it's been my experience, because we are working so hard to keep the survivor safe, sometimes we other this side of things without realizing that we have the potential to make a difference over here as well. So I think that's a really cool piece of this work, and why Lindsay and I are so passionate in making sure that folks know about it, and that there's a potential to create more roles like this across the state and hopefully the nation. So that being said, we've sort of addressed the direct services that we provide to the victim survivor, and this is sort of where we start stepping kind of into those other spaces. In the state of Colorado, folks who have been convicted of sex offenses have a supervision team, and the intention of that is to make sure that people who have specific roles are having communication about what's going on, that the person who's caused harm is not splitting or telling their probation officer one thing and their therapist another thing, and those people are never communicating. The hope is that having this cohesive unit, everybody's on the same page, and that they're moving forward in a way that is going to be beneficial for this person to make sure that they don't commit another offense or create another victim. So those supervision teams generally, and it'll be a little bit different depending on the needs of the person on probation or parole, there will be a supervising officer, whether that's probation if they were sentenced to probation, or parole if they're now being supervised in the community after leaving Department of Corrections. There will be a treatment provider who is specially trained to sort of, and we'll kind of dive into this too, but to address the behaviors that made them think that behaving this way was appropriate in the first place, and making sure that there isn't a creation of a new victim down the road. There is a victim representative. So that is Lindsay and I's official title is PostConviction Victim Advocate, but in this space, we're considered a victim representative. So there's somebody who is present to provide feedback, whether it is directly from the listed victim in the case, or to provide generalized sort of, this is how a lot of people tend to have this experience. Obviously, we know that not everybody has the same experience, but to just have somebody who that is their main focus, is there in that space on behalf of the victim survivor in the case, to make sure that nobody forgets that that person was also impacted. And then, so that's the typical setup for adult supervision. And then when it comes to juveniles who've committed sexual offenses, there are certainly other pieces that step in pretty frequently. And I'll let Lindsay talk about that because a lot of her caseload is juveniles.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the supervision team for juveniles who have been convicted of a sexual offense comes, of course, parents for the juvenile or guardians, foster home care providers, Department of Human Services, social caseworkers. There's often people that are included in most of the supervision team, maybe not all of the meetings, but a lot of them from the juvenile school. So there are some other considerations. A lot of juveniles who have committed a sexual offense have a, what's the GAL? Thank you. Good Lord, brain. A guardian ad litem. So it's a lawyer assigned for the juvenile that makes sure that the team is looking out for the juvenile's best interests. So those are a lot of the ones that come in addition with the juvenile cases.
You'll often see polygraphers included in this as well, and we'll briefly touch on polygraph testing and how it is incorporated as a therapeutic tool and just used for accountability purposes. So they are sort of peripherally off and on involved in these cases. And I also want to reiterate, a victim representative does not have to be a post-conviction victim advocate. A victim representative could be the victim survivor's therapist. It could sometimes, there's a list of them that are outlined, but pretty frequently we'll see that it's the victim survivor's therapist, maybe a parent, somebody that's sort of been approved by the team to be able to step in and to provide that feedback. So in the state of Colorado, the type of probation supervision that folks who have been convicted of sex offenses are put on is called SOISP. And I'm going to mess this up. It's like sex offense intensive specific, no, supervision probation. Okay. Well, I've been doing this for 3 years and there are way too many acronyms to keep track of, but you'd think that'd be an important one. But we call it SOISP. And with typical probation, and I don't know how much everybody in this space knows, so I'll give like a quick overview. But when somebody is sentenced, they are required to sign a list of terms and conditions. And so there are some pretty standard ones that are put into place. Lindsay, what are the standard ones, Lindsay? This will be a fun quiz.
Oof, put me on the spot. So when you commit a crime, just any crime, you get probation terms and conditions. And I think I'd have to look through those again, but I think a lot of that is maintaining full-time employment, checking in with your officer, basic things for a basic criminal offense. And
not creating new law violations.
Not creating new law violations, not contacting any victim that was in your case. So yeah, I think those are some of the general ones. And then there's the whole set of sex offender specifics.
Thank you. It's been one of those days where my brain's just it's not there. So yeah, so there's certainly standard ones, and then we've got the special ones outlined right here, which is the gimme for me. But so things that they take into consideration are internet or computer use. As you can imagine, if somebody has been convicted of a case involving sexually abusive images of children, that they are likely not allowed to just have free range of the internet while they're on probation. So that will either be monitored or they will have no access to it at all for a while. Another one is pornographic materials, social media, that kind of thing. They are required to, or depending on the case, again, there's special conditions. So the judge will identify which ones apply to the sentence. But they will have to register as a sex offender where they currently reside, and then they will have to continue to re-register every year on their birthday is how they typically do it. Contact with individuals under the age of 18 is a consideration that as it stands right now, it's my understanding that it is a blanket condition for everybody. And then the supervision team will then determine whether or not there are people that they approve that are under the age of 18 that folks are allowed to have contact with. There is case law in the state of Colorado, and that's the Burns reference, that if somebody has a parental role to an individual who is under the age of 18, as long as that was not their victim, or it isn't like the type of victim that they may have offended against, that they will be able to continue in that parental role. Typically, they'll be required to report relationships, new romantic relationships, to their supervising officer so that they can make sure that that person is understanding of the person that they've chosen a romantic relationship within has this conviction and is currently being supervised. And then substance use, if that's an issue, that's certainly something that is monitored on probation. There we go. I wish we had this on the first slide, and then I wouldn't have had to stumble over that. SOISP. So probation typically looks like folks having to, essentially the role of the supervising officer is to make sure that that person is stable within the community and is abiding by the rules put in place by the courts. So they will have regularly scheduled appointments that they'll have to check in with their supervising officer to make sure that they're doing the things that they say they've been doing. The supervising officer will do home and work visits to just check in and make sure that they are where they say they have been, and are where they need to be. UAs, if it's relevant to the case, that is the person who will make sure that they are doing those. and aren't, partaking in substance use. And then if there's dual supervision, which sometimes happens if somebody has had a sentence in DOC and then comes out and is doing probation, the parole and probation officers will coordinate on that supervision as well to make sure that they're both having contact with that individual.
Casey,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I was just going to add that in our use of acronyms, if people don't know, UAs are urine analysis.
Drugs, alcohol, they're checking for those things and making sure that folks are doing what they need to. Because ultimately the hope in all of this is that the person is able to address those offending behaviors and never re-victimize someone or victimize someone again. And so we want to make sure that they have stable housing, employment, or are looking for a job or in school, those things that we know, make for somebody who is a contributing member of society, that they are able to have that stability. And so if substance use is an issue, it's hard to address all of those basic needs if you may or may not also be using methamphetamines or alcohol to excess. As Soisp, the supervising officers also monitor disclosures. So there are certain situations where the person who's been convicted of a sex offense is required to tell people like, hey, I'm currently on supervision for this. So they make sure that they are doing that and they are doing it authentically and are taking accountability for their actions. There's also an inclusion of safety planning in all of this. So when somebody is placed on this type of supervision, initially it's pretty strict. They're allowed to go to work, go to a grocery store, go home. And then as they show that they are willing to abide by those terms and conditions that they've agreed to, that they can issue what's called a safety plan. And Lindsay and I joke, because we both come from the victim service world, that they should be called danger plans, because we have always used the term safety planning with victim survivors. But it's called safety planning. And so they can issue those to their supervision team, and the supervision team as a unit can decide whether or not it's appropriate to allow them to go to Olive Garden, to go to the park by their house, that kind of thing. So their movement within the community is supervised. And then they can, again, earn those privileges to be able to do more. And then again, I spoke about that stability. So they're making sure. Yes, absolutely. So that is a piece that we don't have included in this presentation, and we should address now, I think, Lindsay, is that they are required to do an SOEV, a sexual offense evaluation, to determine what piece, because again, every case is going to be different, right? So to determine which pieces they may be at a higher risk for reoffending or relapsing or whatever that looks like. And so that we can make sure that these people are successful when they're on probation, because ultimately that's the goal, is to make sure that they are essentially rehabilitated. Thank you for mentioning that, Sarah.
Yeah, and I would just add too, that's what a lot of what the purpose is for these safety plans that Casey talked about. The person who causes harm assesses their risks with going to a certain activity, sees what hiccups may come up for them or what triggers, and plans for potential, not danger, but plans for potential hiccups, I guess is the best word, in whatever activity they're trying to do. So.
And I'll also just add, so Lindsay and I have received the special training that these probation officers go through. And it has been incredibly helpful for us to understand what probation is looking at and considering when we are supporting victim survivors on the other end of things. So like those questions that Lindsay had shown on that FAQ slide, frequently folks are like, I heard that he is hanging out with a cousin that is under the age of 18. Is that allowed? And so we can help support them through what conditions are potentially in place. If we have a release from the person who's on probation, we can tell them directly. We do have some HIPAA stuff that we definitely have to take into consideration, but to have an understanding of what is happening on that probation and supervision end of things, we are better equipped to help support victim survivors to know what they should anticipate and they should expect to help them feel safe in the community. And then just lastly, this revocations definitely tie in with the probation piece, as that is an extension of the courts. So when somebody is not doing what they're supposed to be doing on probation, whether that's a new law violation, or they are not doing what the terms and conditions outline for them, or aren't engaging in treatment or there's a multitude of things that could come up that may result in a revocation. So the probation officer would file that with the court, and we would help. There are certain system-based advocates that are in place to help notify under the VRA what is going on for victim survivors. And those folks also have very large caseloads. And so what we have found is that it's incredibly helpful for us. And again, we do this in collaboration with all these system-based folks as well. I don't want it to sound like we're coming in and stepping on any toes, but in collaboration with those system-based advocates, we can help support. Hi, Maria. We can help support folks in navigating what the court system looks like returning after sentencing. And in a lot of cases, we are often the most recent advocate that has had contact with these victim survivors, as it may have been several years after sentencing has occurred. So the DA's office may not have had recent contact with them. And so we can help support folks on all ends to make sure that all of their questions are being answered. So Lindsay and I will often attend court, like she'd mentioned earlier, with victim survivors and help them navigate what a revocation looks like. And then potentially resentencing, where the victim survivor would have an opportunity to submit a secondary impact statement.
Okay, so when a person who has committed a sex offense, a juvenile or an adult, has been sentenced to probation, one of the conditions, like Casey was saying, of their probation is to complete offense-specific treatment. And so there's a whole bunch of wonderful providers in the state of Colorado that do this specific kind of therapy and treatment work. And the probation officer or the parole officer will usually provide the person who has committed the sexual offense with a couple of different choices. And then they choose which provider they want to check out, and they get set up with a therapist and they start doing offense specific treatment. It's a bit, we can talk more about that later, but offense specific treatment it consists of individual and or group therapy. It doesn't have to be both. It could be one or the other. The offense specific treatment provider is really working on the whole individual. So they are working on co-occurring needs. And if they're not working on the co-occurring needs, they'll often provide an adjunct therapist for the person who has committed a sexual offense to work with. So sometimes I've seen folks are getting their offense specific therapy with person A, and then they go to person B for some substance abuse therapy and treatment as well. That's just an example. There's a bunch of different modules within the sexual offense specific treatment standards and guidelines that they go through in order to rehabilitate and complete sex offense specific treatment. And then a big part of this treatment is that completion of clarification, which we're going to dive into a little bit more in a minute. But clarification is basically a chance to involve the victim survivor. It's a chance for the person who has committed an offense to take accountability and answer questions that the victim survivor may have. And we'll explain what that can look like when we talk a little bit more about clarification, but it's so important because it is the main portion of all of this where the victim kind of gets pulled in and involved and gets some restorative justice. I think we talk a lot about restorative justice lately in victim support circles and victim advocacy work. And this is one of the things, clarification is one of the things that the criminal legal system has implemented that is more restorative and can be extremely helpful for survivors and victims if they choose to participate. Offense-specific treatment can include polygraph testing. There are many limitations on this, and it's not what people usually think or get told about polygraph testing. It really is a treatment tool. It's designed to be able to elicit accountability from the person who has committed a sexual offense, and kind of dot the T's or dot the I's and cross the T's, and be just a tool for the supervision team and specifically for the treatment provider. The person who has committed a sexual offense cannot go back to court on a polygraph. They can't, get a revocation or, quote, trouble from a polygraph. There's been lots of times where I've had to explain to victims and survivors that the person who offended against them is still successfully completing treatment with failed polygraphs or inconclusive polygraphs. So it's a tool designed to assist. It's not the end all be all. It doesn't give us a lot of answers. It's kind of like when we're working with sexual assault survivors and they want to have a SANE exam to know if they were raped. And it's like, that doesn't tell you what you want to know. And that's the same with these types of things, this polygraph testing. It doesn't give us the peace of mind or the answers that we're always looking for, especially as victims and survivors. But it is a tool that is widely used, especially in adults, in cases with adults. They use it with juvenile offenders as well, but it's definitely more selective and age appropriate, and all of those things. We want to make sure it's healthy for the person.
Sarah just said there are a lot of reasons someone will fail the polygraph, and the SOMB is looking for justification for the polygraph now more than against it. And she's right. I also, for folks who aren't familiar with polygraph testing, I think that there's always been this misnomer that it's a lie detector test. Polygraphs measure levels of deception, but there are so many other factors and things that could be playing into how somebody responds or presents during a polygraph test. A lot of it lies on how the question is asked or the preparation that goes into the process prior to them actually taking the test. So Sarah is absolutely right. They're sort of in this weird in between right now where we're talking about whether or not there is efficacy in using a polygraph or whether or not we should move forward in other tools to determine accountability and treatment. So it's one of those things that I think a lot of folks in the community and the media portrays it as like the police used a polygraph test and they lied. And so that's definitely like the bad guy did it. And that's truly not the case in the way that it is utilized within treatment. And so something that's good to know so that we can continue to support survivors and realistic expectations for what this looks like.
And I think too, a lot of victim survivors get told about the polygraph process within the criminal legal system. And so if you all are working with victim survivors in any capacity during that or after that, you can help educate and kind of dispel some of these false interpretations of what a polygraph actually will do.
Clarification is a tool that is used to determine accountability in treatment. And it is also the biggest opportunity for victim survivors to be involved in this process if they choose to be. Again, this piece is 100% driven by whether or not the victim survivor would even like to engage. And for some people, this is not what they need in their trauma healing journey, and that's okay. But it is an opportunity. And so as Lindsay and I have dived into this work, we have found that there has always been sort of a misconception. Historically, I think that like Lindsay said, there are certainly some people who have identified this gap previously and have been able to step in and notify victim survivors about the opportunity for this. And I think that there's also been a lot of times where people thought that one side of the victim service side knew about this, or maybe the treatment providers knew about this, and we're missing the bus completely. So historically, what we've found is, and I'll dive into this, but clarification is essentially, and it can look like whatever the victim survivor wants, but at bare bones, the person who has caused harm is expected in treatment to write a letter taking accountability for their actions. For victim survivors, this is often the first time that they've ever heard them take accountability. So it can be incredibly powerful if that's something that they feel like they are ready for. It's clarification of everything that happened, right? So it's aptly named. And essentially what happens is the person who caused harm writes a letter in treatment. And then hopefully, if folks are sort of abiding by the standards, the treatment provider is contacting a victim representative to review the letter, either through the perspective of the index victim involved in the case, or to provide sort of generalized feedback on how a victim survivor might feel reading that letter. And so it goes through a revision process until the draft has been approved by everyone on the supervision team, or at least the treatment provider. And then there's an opportunity for the victim survivor to receive that letter. So historically, the issue has been that treatment providers think or have thought, or there's just been this huge misconception. And I won't say all of them, Sarah, I don't want to, I don't want to say this is happening across the board, but what we found was very common is that treatment providers thought that victim survivors would be reaching out if they wanted the letter. And then on our side of things as victim service providers, we didn't even know the letter existed. And so there was sort of a missed opportunity for that. Okay, good. And so what we're hoping to, another thing we're hoping to provide by training folks involved in all sides of these circumstances is that there is an availability for that letter to be shared if that's something the victim survivor wants. We also understand that the trauma healing journey after sexual harm and the outline for probation designed by the court may not always line up. So when somebody over here is finishing writing a letter, this person over here may not be in a place that they're ready to receive it, and that's completely okay. And so one of the great things I think about treatment, and I don't want to speak out of line, but I believe most folks hold on to case files for about 7 years. And so if that timeline doesn't necessarily match up, there's an opportunity down the road for that victim survivor to then reach out through an advocate or a victim representative, or whoever they may be in touch with to receive that letter when they're at a place where it would be appropriate for them to receive it. So again, that process should 100% be driven by the victim survivor, but the person who caused harm is going to be expected to write it regardless of whether or not they choose to engage, because it's really impactful. And as a victim representative, it shows me whether or not they've been internalizing those concepts they've learned about in treatment.
Casey, I have some thoughts on this, but I'm wondering for your caseload, how many victim survivors do you, like, if you could give a ballpark percentage, how many of the victim survivors that you're working with who are approaching clarification actively engaged in their own therapy?
That's a great point. Not a lot.
Yeah.
There's a multitude of reasons for that, unfortunately. So that is something that we talk about in those victim impact groups that we run with folks who have been convicted of sex offenses, is sort of this disparity that they are expected to and required to participate in therapy. And if they can't afford it, and in a lot of cases, there's vouchers that can be put into place to make sure that they are able to have access to that because it's expected by the courts. On the victim survivor side, for folks who provide direct service, we know that there's a limitation in financial resources and availability for therapy and trauma therapy. And for a lot of people, they may not be in a place where they're ready to engage in that either. So there are a multitude of reasons why a victim survivor may or may not be engaged in therapy at the time of clarification. And so folks like Lindsay and I do our best to respect that and empower them to make decisions based on their needs at the time. And they're, again, depending on the case and depending on the dynamic of the family and who the person who caused harm is and who the victim is and their age and that kind of thing, there are certainly conditions and considerations that are put into that. But we want to respect the survivor's autonomy in all of this, because I mean, at the base level of sexual harm, their power and control has been taken away, and it is not our place as advocates to step in and dictate how they may receive a letter like this. And Lindsay, I'm sorry if you had other things to say and I just got on my soapbox.
No, that's exactly what I was thinking. Just that, yeah, we would love for everybody that we interacted with who was a victim survivor to be in therapy. If anything, selfishly, it would help me sleep better at night. But we know that that's not the case, and it's really time for the rest of the world, professionals working within this community and other victim service providers, like a lot of people on this webinar, to know that that's not the case. And just like you said, Casey, it's for a bunch of reasons. I mean, most of my caseload, I would say my victim survivors that I work with are not engaged in therapy. And that's maybe they started it out with crime victim compensation and then they couldn't afford it. We could talk about the mess of the healthcare system in a whole other webinar, and I'd be going on for another couple hours, but there's just a bunch of reasons. They take breaks. It's really tough work. You know, there's all kinds of things. So what we want to make sure we're promoting within this process is that survivors aren't denied the process of clarification, the kind of the right to be informed about this and the right to go through this process if they're not in therapy. So we try to talk about it quite a bit.
And again, just to loop this back into, I don't know why everyone is taking this webinar, but I'm sure glad you're here. That our hope by talking about this is that even if your role is not as a victim representative, but you are providing support to somebody who is engaged in this criminal legal system and has reached this point, that you're able to communicate to them that they do have options if they want to participate. So if in a year you are working with somebody and they say like, hey, I want to know, like, are they taking accountability? Like, have they learned anything in treatment? Any of those things, hopefully you'll reflect back to those two weird women on that webinar and say like, oh, I remember something about that. And at least know that you can reach out to CASA to help get that person connected if that's something that they're looking for. Because truthfully, I have worked in this field for almost a decade and had no idea this was happening. And then on the other side of things, everyone thought that the other side knew what was happening. And so it's something that I'm very passionate in wanting everyone to know about now that I know what it is.
And Sarah put this in the chat too, that a lot of the times I think people working with the person who has committed a sexual offense, they're almost nervous to incorporate the victim side of things because they don't want to re-traumatize. They don't want to cause more harm. But that is why it's also lovely to have your friendly neighborhood victim representative on your speed dial, and that person can reach out to the victim in a trauma-informed way, provide resources, be a person that's separated from the person who caused harm's treatment, and be able to facilitate those discussions. So it's a tricky balance, but yeah, we want it to be provided for as many people that want it. Sorry. So clarification, like Casey was mentioning, it starts with that letter. And that's usually the first step that the person who has caused the offense will do. It can move on from there. So when a victim survivor gets a clarification letter, they have some options too. And this is what's really wonderful about the restorative justice piece of it all. They can, write a written response. They can write their own letter back. I've had many victim survivors who just had some basic questions. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had a juvenile victim. He's 7 years old. So this just all blew us away. But he had a therapist and we kind of explained the clarification process to him. And he's like, great, I have 4 questions. And he named his 4 questions and that's what he wanted answers to. And then some survivors I work with, they're like, I don't know what I want. Let me just read what they wrote and then we'll go from there. So they can respond back, they can ask questions, they can ask to clarify something, things like that. They can also ask for verbal discussions so that we can set up a meeting between the person who caused them harm, the victim survivor, and then usually what will happen is hopefully a victim therapist can be present or a victim representative, and the person who caused harm, their therapist as well. So we have a safe space, controlled space where these people can meet face to face, get answers to questions or talk or whatever the goal for that meeting is. And again, Casey and I are filling in on those roles in a lot of circumstances where victim survivors are not actively engaged in therapy. And I combine verbal discussion with face-to-face meeting, but we've done a couple, especially in the pandemic, you know, we've done a couple of Zoom things, I've facilitated phone calls. So it's really, like we said, this is survivor led. It is what they want to happen. And then hopefully the treatment provider can prepare the person on the other end, the person who caused harm, for what is going to happen. The victim representative role in this process is pretty widespread. And again, based on what the survivor needs, based on who is in their support group as is. So if there is a therapist, Casey and I review and revise letters all the time, all day, every day for treatment providers. And this is huge because when you're working with a specific population, treatment providers want to get other eyes on the letter and want someone to be able to look at it from that zoned in victim perspective. Because when you're working on a project, you're not going to see everything that other people might see. And we're also sometimes privy to knowledge from the victim or survivor that can help with editing the letter. So I'm trying to think of a good example for that. And I'm not coming up with one right away, but if we spot something in the letter that is kind of a red flag, like it's kind of how they used to communicate manipulatively with the victim, or we know that the victim survivor really wants them to address why they involved their family members in the secret, you know, specific considerations like that. So that are things that we can review the letters for as well. The victim representative, again, can be in those face-to-face sessions when the survivor requests it, if they don't have a therapist or in addition to. And Casey and I also do sometimes mock clarifications. So, you know, we'll have a lot of cases where the victim survivor does not want to engage in clarification. And that's totally fine. Obviously, it's survivor driven, it's their choice. But it may be helpful for the person who has committed the sexual offense to have some sort of engagement in that clarification. So Casey and I can step in and do a mock clarification, be a stand-in for the victim survivor, and be able to really tap into the person who caused harm's empathy, accountability, make sure they're getting the most out of the process that they can, even without the victim survivor involvement.
And I want to reiterate that the process of clarification, the intention behind it is not to cause any additional harm. That is something that we are considering in every step of the way. And so the way that I often present my job to the victim survivors that I work with is that I'm just an extension of them with a little bit more knowledge on how this world works. Not the world in general, but this very small world of offense-specific treatment and supervision. And so when we are proceeding with this clarification process, it's something that we are providing as much support, empowerment, education as we can to the victim survivor involved, because our intention is never to share a letter and then to have it like inadvertently hurt them even more. And so the hope is, and going back to what Sarah had mentioned in the chat, is that like we've got some extra eyes on it just to make sure that the person who composed it is not inadvertently causing any additional harm either. And that's not to say that they mean to, but they may put something in there that may or may not be harmful to the victim survivor, and they just didn't even realize it. So having that extra set of eyes that are solely there just to look at it from that perspective can be really helpful, because treatment providers have a lot on their plate. Supervising officers have a lot on their plate, and it can just be helpful to have that third perspective present. So we've talked a lot about these letters. And I remember when Lindsay and I started this job, we were like, they do what? They write a what? And so we've provided an example just so that folks have an idea of what these letters look like. As we've been talking, I also wanted to add that we've found a lot of value in having a role that crosses over this line that I've been talking about. So for a lot of the victim survivors that choose to engage with us, because our services are 100% optional or catered to whatever they need, a lot of it is because they have some sort of relationship with this person. They're likely not a stranger. It could be a family member or somebody they cared very deeply about. And so for a lot of the victim survivors that we work with, oftentimes it's helpful that we have had the opportunity to speak with or meet the person who's caused them harm, because it lets them know that, like, okay, you get it. Like, you know what I'm talking about when I say they do this, or, you know, like that it gives them a little bit more peace of mind to know, like, okay, you're looking out for those behaviors that I'm worried about. You've got an eye on it. I told you, and you've spoken to them and you've seen it firsthand. And so I think a lot of folks have concerns, rightfully so, about how a victim survivor may feel about having their advocate meet directly with the person who caused them harm. And I would say, and Lindsay, speak if this is completely wrong, but for a lot of them, it's helpful for them to know that we've actually met the person that they're talking about. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my experience as well. Again, I think the majority of everyone working in this world, including victims and survivors, we all want the same goal at the end of the day. And that is that the person who caused harm gets healthy and doesn't have other victims. And then hopefully in the process, the victim is able to get healthy and overcome the abuse that they've endured. But I think that we all kind of want the same thing. So it really helps to have a person in his position that is straddling that line and connecting professionals and making sure that we're all on the same page. And you all can read this letter and kind of get an understanding. We put a basic example of what a letter typically looks like. There's a few things that are always in the letter. They always have to take accountability for the abuse. Sometimes this specifically outlines what they did, and sometimes it doesn't. It, of course, depends on the victim. It depends on the age of the victim. It depends on a lot of factors. But a lot of the times they'll say, this happened, and this happened. And that's very helpful for victims and survivors, because they want that accountability. They want that person to say, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and I'm calling it out. Always, we want it to say how it wasn't the victim's fault. As you all, I think, can relate when working with victim survivors in this particular subtext of sexual abuse and sexual violence, there's a lot of guilt that comes with it. Again, like Casey was saying, that person could be a family member or somebody deeply cared for that did this horrific act. The victim could have gone along with what was going on for various reasons of manipulation and grooming and all of those things. So there's a lot of guilt that comes with being a sexual abuse, sexual violence survivor, and having the person who offended say, this isn't your fault. I did this on my own. I set it up. I did it this way. I groomed you like this. I made sure that I could be alone with you at grandma's house. All of those things, sometimes those specific things are helpful to put into the letter for the victim survivor. I get a lot of victim survivors who want to know why. And that's a complicated question, but Casey and I are usually, we'll talk with the treatment provider and see if the person who caused the offense can appropriately put in a why. They want to know why them, why'd you pick me, why'd you do this? And sometimes that's a complicating piece, and that has a lot to do with the person who caused the harm and a lot of their mental health and their own circumstances. But if there's an appropriate way that we can put in there a why, that it's very helpful for victim survivors sometimes. We generally have the person who caused harm kind of empathize with some of the emotions that the survivor could have felt at the time of the offense, during the offense, after the offense, what ramifications they might be feeling in their life from the offense. So they'll put in some things like that, like, I imagine how this could have made you feel. I imagine that this really destroyed your life at school. I imagine, you know, blank, and they empathize with the person that they caused harm to. And then, you know, we always want to also say what's going on now, that they're in treatment, that they're getting the help they need. Some sort of identifying piece to let them know that, I mean, we can never say never, but victims and survivors really want to know that there won't be anybody else that has to endure this kind of suffering. And being told about their treatment, being told about the steps that they've made as a person can really go a long way for them. Case, do you have anything to add with that?
I think you hit the highlights. Again, all of these letters are going to be catered to whatever the victim survivor needs. And so on our end of things as a victim representative, we're notifying them about the opportunity for this and asking them what it looks like for them. So if they have specific questions that they want addressed in this initial letter, then we will absolutely do our best to make sure that those are incorporated. I often look at, so from the victim representative side, I am approaching this letter as like that, like, this is what, show me you learned something in treatment. This is you writing on paper all of the things that like you should have learned for the person who's caused harm, that you should have learned and internalized in treatment. And then on the other end of things, for a lot of victim survivors, this is sort of the initial olive branch, if you will. It's for some of them, this is it. They get the letter and they're like, this is what I needed from that person. That is all I want them to offer me. I am done with this piece of my life and I'm going to move forward. And for other people, it's just the beginning. This is them opening the door to them even potentially having a future relationship, whatever that looks like. I find that happens often in cases where the victim may have been the child of the person who caused them harm, and they're still wanting to have some sort of relationship with them moving forward. And so from this letter, we could then potentially set up those sessions that Lindsay had talked about, and potentially move towards a reunification. And again, this is all about giving the power back to the victim survivor who had it taken away, in whatever way we can make sure that we're safely doing that, both for the victim survivor and the person who caused them harm, because we would never want to put anyone in a circumstance where they will ever reoffend again, and also never want to put a victim survivor in a place where we could potentially place them in harm again if we can help it. Certainly there are circumstances beyond everybody's control sometimes, but if there are ways that we can do it thoughtfully and safely, that is absolutely what this clarification process is built in to do, while this person is still being supervised and is in therapies, to make sure that they are, again, doing it safely with the support that they need as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the other thing that I would just say is clarification is a mixed bag, and we want the victim survivor to have the opportunity for it no matter what. We want to educate them on their options. But I've had it both ways. I've had where victim survivors I've worked with, it really created some closure. It really created some healing. It answered some questions. It allowed a family to reunify, all of those wonderful things that we hope it does. And I've had some victim survivors who thought it wasn't helpful and didn't appreciate that perspective from the offender. Many of those victim survivors are still glad they chose to look at the letter or participate a little bit when I asked them, but it's a mixed bag. It's not all unicorns and sunshine. It's complicated, and sometimes it goes really, really well, and then sometimes it's not that great for the victim survivor, and that's okay too. I mean, as long as they have the support and resources available for them to be dealing with what is not okay about that, that's how it is sometimes.
Yeah, so we're certainly providing that. That should also be noted. We don't just like give them the letter and then leave. We're making sure that these folks have supports in place. We are game planning way ahead of time. Like, okay, so what if you receive this letter and you read it and it brings up all of these feelings and you feel terrible, and like, how are we going to do this safely? So we're absolutely navigating that on the back end, to make sure that there are supports in place, because trauma is a funny thing and you never know how it's going to show up until it shows up. and what could potentially be a trigger that they hadn't anticipated. And so we want to make sure, again, that we have sort of a safe place to land when they do receive that letter with whatever comes with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, it's complicated. Life is complicated. So you can imagine this world of this horrific crime that took place is complicated. And I often prepare my victim survivors that what if you don't like the answer to the question you're asking? What if it's not the answer you thought you were going to get? You know, all of those things. So like Casey said, we really do, as victim representatives, PCVAs, we prepare them for this process as best as we can. If anyone has any questions about that, feel free to please put it in the chat, because that was a lot of information and it's a complicated thing. So
I'll also note that in collaboration with Maria, Lindsay and I are working on creating a more comprehensive resource that's going to be available for folks at some point. And we'll have that sent out on the CCASA mailing list. But our hope is that we can create sort of this comprehensive place that people can go so that they can get all of their questions about what clarification looks like, could look like, and have the support around that. Because often, again, it's just me and Lindsay. And so oftentimes in these spaces, you're not going to have a post-conviction victim advocate, but you may have a victim therapist or a support person for the survivor. And so we want to make sure that all of those people have the support that they need to then step forward and advocate for this victim survivor in those spaces. So our goal is to help make this more accessible for everybody, so that if a victim survivor in an area that isn't encompassed by our service window is able to participate in a safe way.
and we'll work with therapists across the state that are the most amazing people. They're wonderful therapists that are truly healing and helping the victim, and they've never worked with clarification before. And that's okay, because they're doing what they need to do. We could come in and help them with the clarification piece. So we've had that experience a lot too.
Yeah, so certainly we help them like navigate logistics on that. And but as somebody who may have been working with the victim survivor very closely in a very intimate setting for years, perhaps, obviously they would be the best suited person to then step in and help be a support to them during this process. So we're very cognizant of that as well. Policy. So I have a social work background, and we love to talk about like the micro, meso, and macro levels, right? So on the micro level, we're providing direct services to folks. On the meso level, we're stepping into these supervision teams. And then on the macro level, and I think Sarah mentioned this in the chat too, there's the Sex Offender Management Board. And we spoke about this earlier as well. But the SOMB, like I said, there are a lot of acronyms, but I got this one. The SOMB oversees the standards and policies and rules and regulations for the treatment providers who are providing this therapy. And so there is a board of folks who meets monthly, and the next meeting is actually this coming Friday, and it is an open meeting on WebEx, and I'm gonna put the link to that in the chat if anybody wants to attend, because it's fascinating, where they address sort of issues that are coming up. And that is going to be something we're talking about today. So they are, again, responsible for regulating and figuring out what treatment looks like in the state of Colorado. And there are certain representatives from different spaces that are present on that board. So we've got victim representatives. We have 3 of those currently. We've got folks from the Department of Corrections. We've got treatment providers for adults. We've got treatment providers for juveniles. We've got judges. We've got DAs. We've got public defenders. Folks who are representing every interest that you could possibly have within this space of folks who are providing this treatment. And so fortunately for Lindsay and I, part of the grant that funds our jobs requires that we are present and active within the context of the Sex Offender Management Board. So we participate in a variety of monthly meetings, whether that is the Victim Advocacy Committee meeting, where we talk about trends about what are coming up for survivors in these spaces in the criminal legal system, ways that we can better advocate for their needs. We've got different provisions committees, which sort of are regularly reevaluating how effectively certain rules and regulations are working and whether or not there's an opportunity for improvement. They try to be as evidence-based and research-based as possible when making these decisions. And then we're often changing, the language in the way these standards are written. So as recently as the last year or so, we took the word deviant out of the standards and changed it to, do you remember, Lindsay? It's like a whole sentence. So definitely.
Yeah, it's usually a whole sentence. We'll take one word in the SOMB and then change it to a paragraph.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that we addressed language at the beginning of our presentation, and Sarah mentioned in the chat, is that they are currently, so we have already been through the process where the decision to make this change has been approved. So they will be changing the language. So they are removing the term sex offender from the standards. And it is only the standards, right? So that is the only thing that the Sex Offender Management Board has purview over. So places like the registry, the sex offender registry, that will be remaining the same. Legislation, courts will still continue to use the term sex offender, but they are removing, the intention is to remove it from the standards. And at this month's board meeting on Friday, the one that I put the registration link in the chat for, will be determining what that's going to be. So there's been lots of conversation about the pros and cons of different terms. They have already changed it in the juvenile standards. And if it's a juvenile convicted of a sexual offense, am I correct in that, Lindsay?
I think it's juvenile who committed a sexual offense.
Okay. So there we go. And so currently having conversations around all of that within the standards, and whether or not certain terms really encompass everybody who could potentially be under the purview of the SOMB, and whether or not words like committed in the past tense are encompassing of people who could potentially still be committing these crimes, or whether we use the word convicted, or so it's been a hot topic. And wanted to put that on folks' radars because it's something that this board oversees. I will be honest, there's not a whole lot of victim representation in these meetings aside from those board members and Lindsay and myself. And a lot of that is just because people don't have the capacity to attend, but I would encourage you to look into the SOMB and what they are doing and maybe getting subscribed to their newsletter. Because they certainly are the ones that have control, at least in the state of Colorado, over what treatment looks like and what folks are prioritizing. So people who are often specific treatment providers are required to submit an application to be an SOMB approved provider in the state, and then are again governed by this board. What have I forgotten?
I think that was it. I would just say to our attendees, you know, if you're working with sexual assault survivors and you have the perspective from them, it's wonderful for you to be in those spaces. And like Casey said, keeping up to date on what's going on and putting in victim survivor focused opinions when necessary. Because again, we need to have a balance of everybody involved in each aspect. And so having that victim voice from folks like you all who are working with people directly is super important.
And yes, they do have an annual conference. Lindsay and I actually presented at the one this year via WebEx, which was great because I could sit at home and I'm wearing slippers that look like sharks right now. I don't think I'm supposed to admit that in person, but yeah, so it's a great opportunity to hear about the work that everybody is doing, and in different capacities, and again, that are even peripherally involved in what the SOMB oversees. So supervising officers attend to make sure that, again, those supervision teams have a good understanding of what each person's role is and the expectations for each of them.
So this part, I know we're getting a little close on time, so I'll make sure that I can get to this information in the allotted time we have left. But victim representation on the supervision teams is extremely important, in my opinion. Victim advocates who are working with the survivor can be victim representatives. A big aspect where that's important is, remember when we talked about the person who caused sexual offense doing safety planning. I contribute to the supervision teams that I've involved in a lot on these processes, because you're providing a perspective and a voice that other members may have not thought about or don't know about. You don't know what you don't know. I had a guy a couple of weeks ago who wanted to do a bike race, and the path of the race went directly behind the juvenile victim's house. That's just something that not everybody would know, and even something sometimes Casey and I don't know. But if we know it, we can contribute it, and we can make sure that everyone's as safe as possible. We had a juvenile a couple of months ago who didn't put in a safety plan for something that he wanted to do, and ended up going to an establishment for their teen night. The victim was there. It created all of this havoc for everybody, and it's just a lot of things that we can incorporate victim voice and victim perspective in that can be avoided. We're often putting that perspective of, the victim survivor, the impact they felt, either as the victim in this specific case or in a generalized viewpoint. We're able to bring questions or concerns to either the probation officer or the treatment provider. There are so many times each week when I email treatment providers I work with and I say, hey, I spoke with the victim. They're kind of wondering about this. What can we share with them? How can we address this? What are your thoughts? And it's super helpful for everybody, but super helpful for the victim, because they're getting access to that perspective that's so valuable, and they're getting answers to the things that they stay up late worrying about. And then of course, like we already discussed, clarification. One thing we didn't really dive deep into is reunification. It's a subset of clarification. It just means that when there was an offense committed mostly familially, like a brother and a sister, an uncle and a niece, something like that, reunification is the process in which the family can come back together in a healthy and safe way. And sometimes the team decides that reunification is not acceptable in a case, and that's okay too. If that's the best outcome for both the person who caused harm and the victim in the case, then that's okay too. I think that a lot of times in this world, we're always striving for reunification, and we're hoping for the best outcome we can possibly have, and maybe the best outcome is not that. So Casey and I, victim representatives, can help figure that all out. Casey, is there anything else you want to add with the supervision team piece?
I don't think so. I think that covers it.
So here's our contact information. And I will say that every time I'm in a webinar and the presenter provides their contact information, I never feel comfortable enough to email them and be like, hey, I was in that webinar, have this random question for you. But I want to assure you that this is not a time where that's the case. So if you have questions, if you want to get connected, if you have just random thoughts that you want to express to people doing this work, any of those things, please, please, please know that you are welcome to contact us at any time. We're happy to or chat or do anything that we can.
Yeah, we also acknowledge that this is a gap in services in a lot of places, and that working in Denver, Lindsay and I are fortunate that we found an agency that would house this grant, that would pay for our salaries, that we are able to provide these services for free. We're also happy to help connect folks with other people who may be doing similar work either around the state, talk about what our agency needed to do to get this program up and running in Colorado. I will say that supervision does look a little bit different in other states, but it's certainly something that is needed and still exists, right? So we are, one of my colleagues recently joked that people adding me on LinkedIn is my love language, and she's not wrong. So please don't be afraid to reach out if you have questions or want to sort of collaborate on ways that we as a society can help support survivors, victims, folks who have caused harm in a safer way to make a safer community.
And if you're working in your roles or in any aspect with victims and survivors of sexual violence, and you come up on some of these issues, please contact us. We've often, over the last year, it's been hard with the pandemic, but we've thought of connecting, serving people, providing services to victims, and making maybe like a formal meeting or a space where we can all connect and share best practices and get advice and staff cases anonymously and things like that. So all that being said, that if you're coming up in any of this work in the aspects of your roles, please reach out if it would be helpful. I think that's it. I think we're done. If anyone has any questions, we would be happy to answer them. You could unmute, you can put them in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with. We'd be happy to answer any questions that are popping up for folks.
And thanks for sticking around. That was an hour and a half of like a lot of stuff that Lindsay and I get really excited about, but also know that like it's heavy, it's like sort of dry and heavy. So we appreciate you guys. And again, any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Agatha, I don't think I'm seeing any. I don't know if you have anything to add, if you want to close this out, or if we're good to just.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, fantastic. So thank you so much to both of you. What happened is that my computer got frozen again with Zoom. But yeah, one of the things I wanted to say before when you were talking about the SOMB meeting that is coming up, that one of the things that we have noticed throughout the years is there's a lot of people representing the people who cause harms, mothers, sisters, all of them, but
Yes.
advocates, there's always like 3 or 4 of us there. So yes, thanks for inviting people to attend that, because the more of us that we can be there, the more support that we can provide and voices for those survivors, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah, secondly,
absolutely.
thank you so much to you both for being here. I again cannot see anything in the chat because it's also frozen. So
I think we're good. I think mine is not, and I think we're good to go.
fantastic. Okay, so we are 1 minute about to be 4 o'clock, which was the framework for these. Thank you so much for both of you again, for Lindsay and Casey, and thank you so much for the amazing work that you do. We would love to have a copy of your presentation. If you haven't given it to Maria, please send it to me, and that way we can send it after this webinar. We will be sending an email, so we will be sending any kind of documentation or anything that you want to share with the participants today. So again, fantastic work. Keep on going on these, because it's an area that we do not do a lot of it. So again, thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon. I would like to do a couple announcements that we will not have any webinars for the rest of the year. We want to take a break, give the staff and all of those presenters a moment to recharge, and then we will be back with you all with more webinars next year in January. Any other things is that reminder is that we will be sending that follow-up email with all the information about these the handouts and everything like that. And yeah, have a fantastic afternoon and a fantastic holidays coming up. Thank you all.